My name is Diana Mayers. I am 28 years old, and exactly 15 years ago, when I was only 13, my own parents packed my life into 2 black garbage bags and threw me out of their house. I was discarded like a piece of broken furniture simply because I refused to sacrifice my one chance at a future to cater to their favorite daughter. They abandoned me in the dark without a second thought, entirely convinced that I would amount to nothing and that they would never have to answer for their cruelty. But life has a spectacular, deeply ironic way of balancing the scales. Because the same parents who threw me onto the cold concrete 15 years ago recently walked into a high-rise boardroom, flanked by an expensive, silver-haired lawyer, aggressively demanding a 50% cut of the $24 million real estate empire I now control. They thought they were walking into a massive payday. They had absolutely no idea they were walking blindly into their own legal execution. Growing up in our modest house in Southeast Portland, I learned very early on that love was a finite resource, and in the Mayers household, my sister Tiffany held a total monopoly. My father, Richard, was a passive auto mechanic who spoke mostly in grunts and agreed with whatever my mother said. My mother, Sandra, was a grocery store cashier who ran our home with the terrifying precision of a dictator who always knew exactly who deserved what. Tiffany, who was 2 years older than me, had my mother's golden blonde hair, her bright blue eyes, and her easy, theatrical laugh. I, on the other hand, took after our late grandmother, brown hair, brown eyes, and a quiet, observant disposition. I wasn't rebellious or difficult. I was just the spare child, kept around but never truly wanted. The differences in our treatment were glaring and inescapable. When Tiffany turned 15, my mother threw her a lavish party with catered food, a 3-tier bakery cake, and a rented karaoke machine. 3 months later, for my 13th birthday, it was just the 4 of us around the kitchen table. My mother had brought home a marked-down, stale cake from the grocery store where she worked. The frosting said, "Happy Birthday," with no name, a generic leftover from a canceled order. But the true depth of my erasure didn't hit me until I accidentally found bank statements in the home office. Tiffany had a college savings account that had been active since she was 5, holding thousands of dollars. I asked my mother why I didn't have one. She looked at me as if the question itself was an insult. "Tiffany needs money for college," she had sneered. "You'll figure something out, you're good at adapting." I adapted by pouring myself into my academics. I realized early that if I couldn't be the daughter they loved, I would be the student they couldn't ignore. In April of 2010, I secretly applied for the Oregon STEM Summer Academy at Oregon State University. It was a rigorous, 6-week residential program for exceptional students. The scholarship covered everything: tuition, room, board, and materials. I didn't tell anyone I applied. I had learned not to voice my hopes out loud in a house designed to crush them. When the acceptance letter arrived on May 15th, revealing I was one of only 50 students selected from across the state, I felt a soaring, unprecedented sense of pride. For exactly 1 afternoon, I felt like I mattered. I proudly showed the letter to my parents at the dinner table. My mother didn't smile. She didn't congratulate me. She simply looked at the letter, her eyes calculating, and then she looked at Tiffany. Tiffany had recently found a performing arts camp in California that cost $800, but it offered no scholarships. "Diana, you'll decline that science thing," my mother announced, her voice flat and casual, as if she were deciding what to have for dinner. "We can't afford to send both of you to summer programs, and Tiffany's camp will look better on her college applications. Your father will use the travel money we would have spent on you to pay for Tiffany's tuition." I sat at the table, my hands trembling. No. The word dropped like a bomb. The refrigerator seemed to stop humming. My mother's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "Excuse me," she hissed. "This scholarship isn't your money to redirect," I said, my voice shaking but absolutely clear. "I earned this. I'm going." My mother looked at me as if a cockroach had just spoken to her. She stood up, leaning over the table. "If you can't sacrifice for this family, then you are not a part of this family." At 13, I thought she was just using dramatic, angry words to scare me into submission. I didn't realize she meant it literally. 3 days after that dinner, I walked home from the public library, my backpack heavy with science textbooks. As I approached our house, my stomach plummeted. Sitting on the front porch, slumping against the wooden railing, were 2 black plastic garbage bags. My mother was standing in the open doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. The anger from the dinner table was entirely gone. In its place was a terrifying, hollow resolve, the look of a woman who had just finished taking out the trash and was washing her hands of it. "I called Harold," Sandra said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "He'll be here to pick you up in a few hours. From now on, you're his problem." I froze on the bottom step, my 13-year-old brain violently short-circuiting. Harold was my father's older brother, a man who lived 3 hours away in Seattle and whom we barely saw because my parents despised him. "Mom, what are you doing?" I whispered, my vision blurring with panicked tears. "I live here." "Not anymore," she replied coldly. I looked past her shoulder into the hallway. My father, Richard, was standing near the kitchen. He was looking at the floor. He didn't step forward. He didn't tell his wife she was being insane. He just stood there in cowardly, pathetic silence while his youngest daughter was banished from her own home. I looked up at the second-floor window. The curtain twitched. Tiffany was standing there, watching me. When our eyes met, she offered no sympathy. She simply took a step back into the shadows of her bedroom, perfectly content to watch me be disposed of so she could have the entire house to herself. "Wait on the porch," Sandra ordered. And then she shut the heavy wooden door. The lock clicked. I sat down on the cold concrete beside my garbage bags. I waited from 6:00 p.m. until 10:00 p.m., 4 hours in the chilling Oregon evening. The porch light was never turned on. Not once did the door open to offer me a glass of water, a jacket, or a goodbye. I pulled my knees to my chest, crying until there was no moisture left in my body, agonizing over what was so fundamentally broken inside of me that my own mother could throw me away over a science camp. Just after 10, a gray Honda sedan pulled into the driveway. The headlights swept across the dark porch. Uncle Harold got out of the car. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a gentle face. He walked up the steps, looked at me shivering next to the trash bags, and didn't ask a single question. He just knelt down and wrapped his arms around me in a hug so tight and fierce it knocked the breath out of my lungs. "From now on, Diana," he said quietly, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't yet name, "you have a home, you're safe." He loaded my bags into the trunk, opened the passenger door for me, and drove me away into the night. As we drove north toward Seattle, I watched the dark trees blur past the window, feeling utterly shattered. But what I didn't know, what Uncle Harold shielded me from for 15 years, was what had happened inside the house during those 4 hours I sat on the porch. When Harold had arrived, he hadn't just packed my bags. My parents had invited him inside, laid a legal document on the kitchen table, and signed it. They didn't just kick me out, they eagerly, legally severed themselves from my existence. It was a secret that would remain buried until the day it became the very weapon that would destroy them. Uncle Harold's house in Seattle's Ballard neighborhood became my sanctuary. Harold was a self-made man who had started with nothing, worked double shifts for 6 years, and eventually built Mayor's Property Holdings, a highly lucrative commercial real estate firm. He had never married and had no children. When I arrived on his doorstep, broken and discarded, he didn't just give me a room, he gave me a foundation. He didn't treat me like a burden, he treated me like an investment. Under his quiet, unwavering support, the invisible, unwanted spare child transformed. I graduated high school as valedictorian with a 4 GPA. I attended the University of Washington on a partial scholarship, earning my degree in finance. By the time I was 24, I was a certified CPA. Harold brought me into his company, teaching me the commercial real estate business from the ground up, from property assessments to tenant relations. When I turned 26, I was named the Chief Financial Officer of Mayor's Property Holdings, helping manage a portfolio worth over $23 million. For 15 years, my biological parents were ghosts. They called Uncle Harold once in 2012 to beg for $5,000 when my father lost his job. Harold hung up on them. They never asked how I was doing. They never called on my birthday. I built a beautiful, fulfilling life entirely without them. Then, in the summer of 2024, the foundation of my world shook. Uncle Harold was diagnosed with advanced stage congestive heart failure. The doctors gave him 12 to 18 months. He fought bravely, but his heart was simply too tired. During his final months, he spent hours with his estate attorneys, quietly arranging his affairs. "Everything is taken care of, Diana," he would tell me, squeezing my hand from his hospital bed. "You just focus on the business." I've handled the vultures. Uncle Harold passed away peacefully in February 2025. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath. My grief was vast and consuming, but I had a company to run and an estate to manage. 1 week after his memorial, which my biological family did not attend, my phone rang. It was an unknown Portland number. Diana. The voice was unmistakable. 15 years hadn't changed my mother's particular, sharp cadence. "Sandra," I replied, my voice instantly dropping to a cold, professional neutral. "I heard about Harold," she said, feigning a somber tone. "I also heard there's a will reading coming up. Family has a right to attend these things, especially when it involves a brother's estate." I hung up the phone and immediately called Margaret Morrison, Uncle Harold's fierce, razor-sharp estate attorney. Margaret confirmed my worst suspicions. Sandra and Richard hadn't just called to attend, they had hired a sleazy, high-stakes litigator named Victor Harrington. They had filed a formal legal claim challenging Harold's will, alleging undue influence. Their claim stated that I, a manipulative, estranged child, had isolated Harold in his dying days to steal his fortune. As Harold's only surviving brother, Richard was aggressively demanding 50% of the $24 million estate based on the natural bonds of brotherhood. The people who had abandoned me at 13 were back, smelling blood and money, ready to tear apart the legacy of the man who had actually raised me. The next morning, I sat in Margaret Morrison's opulent office on the 47th floor of the Columbia Center, looking out at the rain-streaked windows overlooking Elliott Bay. "Victor Harrington's strategy is transparent, but dangerous," Margaret explained, sliding the formal challenge across her desk. "They don't actually need to win this case in court, Diana. If they force this into litigation, the entire estate, your operating capital, the property deeds, the liquid assets, will be frozen during the discovery phase. That could take 18 months. They are betting that you will be so terrified of losing the company's momentum that you will pay them a massive settlement, say $1 million, just to make them go away." I stared at the paperwork. My mother had actually written in her affidavit that I had abandoned my family. The audacity made my blood boil. "What are our options?" I asked, my voice tight. Margaret leaned back in her leather chair, a slow, predatory smile creeping across her face. "Option 1, we negotiate a settlement. Option 2, we let the will reading proceed as scheduled. We let them attend." Because Harold anticipated this exact move, Diana. He knew Richard's greed better than anyone, and he left us a loaded gun. Margaret signaled her assistant, who brought in a yellowed archival folder. Margaret opened it and slid a single, officially stamped document toward me. "Do you know what happened inside your house while you were waiting on the porch that night in 2010? Margaret asked gently. I shook my head, staring at the paper. The header read, "Voluntary relinquishment of parental rights and transfer of guardianship." "Your parents didn't just kick you out," Margaret said, her voice firm. "They legally threw you away. They signed this document, notarized and filed with the state, voluntarily stripping themselves of all parental rights to you. As far as the law is concerned, Richard and Sandra Mayers stopped being your family the moment the ink dried." I touched the signatures at the bottom, my mother's looping script, my father's messy scrawl. "What does this mean for their lawsuit?" I whispered. "It means," Margaret's smile widened, "that Richard has absolutely no legal standing to claim inheritance through a familial relationship with Harold's designated heir. He severed that connection himself. It is a fatal flaw in their case. If we go to the will reading, we don't just defeat them, we legally annihilate them on the record. I thought about the tears I had shed on that concrete porch. I thought about the 15 years of silence. I thought about Uncle Harold building his empire and shielding me from the truth of this document so I wouldn't feel the sting of their absolute rejection. Option 2, I said, my voice turning to steel. No settlements, no negotiations. We proceed with the will reading. Let them walk into the room. Friday, March 14, 2025. The Morrison and Associates conference room was a theater of corporate power. A massive oak table dominated the space, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows. By 1:45 p.m., the room was already filled with essential personnel. Thomas Graham, the senior auditor, sat near the window. 3 representatives from major Seattle charities, Children's Hospital, Habitat for Humanity, and the National Park Foundation, sat along the wall, invited as neutral witnesses per Harold's strict instructions. 5 of my senior staff members from Mayor's Property Holdings were present. I sat directly across from Margaret at the head of the table, wearing a tailored navy suit, my posture perfectly rigid. At exactly 2:03 p.m., the glass doors of the elevator lobby opened. Sandra Mayers led the charge, striding into the conference room with the unearned, staggering arrogance of a queen returning to her subjects. She wore a brand-new black dress and a pearl necklace, projecting an expression of dignified, manufactured grief. Richard shuffled in behind her, wearing an ill-fitting gray suit, his eyes darting nervously around the opulent room. Tiffany followed, wearing a pastel pink dress, looking around as if she were touring a museum. Finally, Victor Harrington entered, clutching a Mont Blanc briefcase, exuding the smug confidence of a lawyer who thought he was dealing with an amateur. Sandra's eyes swept the room until they locked onto me. "Ah," she said, her voice deliberately loud. "You're here already." I was hoping we could speak privately. Family matters should be handled by family. "The proceedings begin in 2 minutes," I replied, not standing, not offering a handshake. "Take a seat." Margaret stood up. "Mrs. Mayers, Mr. Harrington." The main table is reserved for estate representatives and beneficiaries. There are seats arranged for attending parties along the wall. Sandra's jaw clenched. She had expected a seat of honor. Instead, she was being physically marginalized. But she didn't sit quietly. She paraded past the charity representatives, pausing in front of Dr. Patricia Wells from the Children's Hospital. "I'm Sandra," she announced loudly. "Harold's sister-in-law. We were quite close before this unfortunate estrangement. It's tragic how some people come into a family and create division." Harold was too trusting. She glared at me. I didn't blink. I let her spin her web. I let her climb as high as she wanted on her pedestal of lies, knowing exactly how hard the fall was going to be. "It is 2:10 p.m. Margaret interrupted sharply. "We will begin." Margaret broke the wax seal on the envelope with clinical precision. "This is the last will and testament of Harold Raymond Mayers," she read, her voice echoing through the silent room. She quickly established the legal foundation, noting that a psychiatric evaluation had been conducted 8 days prior to the signing, confirming Harold was of completely sound mind and under zero undue influence. Sandra and Victor Harrington exchanged a brief, irritated glance. Their primary legal strategy had just taken a massive hit within the first 60 seconds. Margaret moved to Article 4, the inventory of assets. She read off the list flawlessly. 12 commercial properties valued at $18 $2 million. Investment accounts at $4 $1 million. Liquid assets totaling $1 $4 million. I heard Tiffany whisper to Sandra, "That's almost $24 million." Sandra nodded, a greedy, hungry light igniting in her eyes. Article 5, Margaret continued, turning the page, regarding Richard James Mayers, brother of the deceased. Sandra actually smiled. She sat forward, waiting for the payout. "I make no provision in this will for my brother, Richard," Margaret read, her voice ringing out like a gavel strike. "For the following reasons, which I wish to be entered into the public record. First, in March of 2002, Richard borrowed $80,000 from me. 23 years have passed. Not a single dollar has been returned. I have retained the original promissory note." Richard's face drained of color. He slumped in his chair. Second, Margaret read, raising her voice slightly. On July 15, 2010, Richard and his wife Sandra voluntarily executed a legal document relinquishing all parental rights to their daughter Diana, transferring full guardianship to me. By legally terminating their relationship with Diana, they severed any claim to inherit from me through her. Richard has no familial relationship with my designated heir and no standing to challenge this will. That is ridiculous. Sandra shrieked, shooting to her feet, her pearls rattling against her chest. That paper means nothing. We are still her family. Mrs. Mayers, sit down, Margaret ordered. She pulled out the certified 2010 relinquishment document and slapped it onto the center of the oak table. This is a certified court document. You have zero legal standing here. She manipulated him. Sandra screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. Victor, tell them we are contesting this. Margaret, please continue to Clause 7, I said calmly, leaning back in my chair. Margaret adjusted her glasses. Article 7, Designation of Sole Beneficiary. I hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate to my legally adopted daughter, Diana Marie Mayers. The room stopped breathing. Adopted, Richard rasped, his eyes bulging. Since when? September 12, 2012, Margaret stated cleanly. When Diana was 15. As you had already relinquished your parental rights, your consent was not required. Diana is my daughter in every legal and emotional sense. There is no one more deserving of this inheritance. Sandra looked as if she had been physically struck with a baseball bat. The blood rushed out of her face, leaving her chalk white. Her mouth hung open in absolute, devastating disbelief. The $24 million she thought she was entitled to had just been permanently, legally sealed behind a vault she could never open. Victor, do something, Sandra demanded, her voice shrill with panic, turning to her high-priced lawyer. Tell them this is illegal. Tell them we're suing. Victor Harrington did not stand up. He did not puff out his chest. He sat perfectly still, staring at his legal pad as if it had caught fire. Margaret tapped her iPad, projecting an email onto the large screen at the front of the conference room. Mr. Harrington, Margaret said, her voice dripping with professional disdain. Perhaps you'd like to explain this email thread to your clients. Dated March 3, 2022. From Harold Mayers to Victor Harrington. Margaret read the email aloud to the stunned room. Victor, I am terminating our professional relationship. Your advice that I include Richard in my estate plan, despite his financial exploitation and abuse of Diana, is unacceptable. Margaret lowered her iPad, glaring at the lawyer. You previously represented Harold Mayers. You were fired for a conflict of interest. And now, you have accepted a case against Harold's estate without disclosing that prior relationship and conflict of interest to your current clients. You knew this challenge was baseless. Victor Harrington's face turned the color of ash. He realized in real time that he had walked into a meticulously designed trap that was going to cost him his legal license. Without saying a single word to Sandra or Richard, Victor frantically shoved his papers into his Mont-Blanc briefcase, snapped it shut, and stood up. Victor, where are you going? Sandra shrieked, grabbing his sleeve. He ripped his arm away. I need to review my files, he muttered, practically sprinting for the conference room door. The heavy glass clicked shut behind him. Sandra was left standing completely alone, abandoned by her lawyer, publicly humiliated in front of major charity directors and corporate executives. Richard was staring at the floor, totally defeated. Tiffany looked like she wanted to melt into the wall. Desperate, stripped of her pride and her weapon, Sandra turned to me. The anger vanished, replaced by a sickening, pathetic display of wounded motherhood. Diana, sweetheart, she whimpered, her hands trembling as she took a step toward the table. I know things were hard. I was overwhelmed back then, but we're still family, aren't we? Blood is blood. We can still work this out, please. I stood up slowly, buttoning my blazer. I looked at the woman who had packed my childhood into garbage bags. You gave up the right to call me sweetheart 15 years ago, I said, my voice echoing with the icy finality of a judge delivering a sentence. You stopped being my family the moment you signed that paper. I don't hate you, Sandra. I just feel absolutely nothing for you. You have no claim on me, my life, or my father's legacy. I turned to the security guard standing near the door. Please escort these 3 individuals out of the building. Their presence is no longer required. Sandra began to weep, real, bitter tears of total loss, as the guards firmly directed them toward the elevators. The doors slid shut, severing them from my life forever. The aftermath was exactly as absolute as Uncle Harold had designed it to be. Margaret Morrison immediately filed a formal complaint with the Washington State Bar Association against Victor Harrington. 3 months later, he was suspended from practicing law for 6 months and heavily fined for his egregious ethical violations. His reputation was ruined, and his top corporate clients abandoned his firm. Sandra attempted to send me a long, manipulative email full of excuses about her financial struggles and requests to make things right. I replied with exactly 4 sentences. I read your email. I forgave you a long time ago for my own peace, not for yours. I do not want a relationship with you. Do not contact me again. She never did. The unexpected closure came from Tiffany. 2 months later, I received a handwritten letter from her. It contained no excuses, no pleas for money, and no manipulation. She simply wrote, "I watched you sit on that porch for 4 hours. I was a coward for not coming down to sit with you. I failed you as an older sister. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I just need you to know that I know I was wrong." Through the guidance of my therapist, I decided to reply. I didn't offer a full reconciliation, but I offered a heavily boundaried opening. A strict 15-minute video call once a month with zero discussion of our parents or the estate. She accepted. We are slowly, cautiously building something new entirely on my terms. Under my leadership, Mayer's property holdings flourished, growing its portfolio by 12% in a single year. But my proudest achievement was the bronze plaque I mounted outside our oldest commercial building. It reads, "The Harold R. Mayers Building, in memory of a man who chose love over blood." I also established the Mayers STEM Scholarship at Seattle Children's Hospital, fully funding summer academic programs for brilliant children who come from broken homes. A valuable lesson for the listener. If there is one profound truth to take away from this story, it is this: family is not defined by DNA. It is defined by choice, respect, and consistent love. And your worth is determined by what you build when everyone else counts you out. Society often forces the narrative that blood is thicker than water, weaponizing loyalty to trap people in abusive, toxic dynamics. We are told we must forgive and accommodate the people who hurt us simply because we share a last name. But genetics do not grant anyone a free pass to exploit, abandon, or abuse you. You are under no obligation to set yourself on fire to keep the people who threw you in the cold warm. Uncle Harold taught me that the greatest revenge against toxic people isn't cruelty. It is the absolute, untouchable success of a life lived brilliantly without them. When toxic people abandon you, they expect you to fail. Surviving them, thriving despite them, and ultimately enforcing ironclad boundaries against them is the ultimate victory. You have the power to write your own story, to choose your own family, and to build an empire out of the very bricks they threw at you. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace, or been the family scapegoat who finally broke free and realized your true worth? Please drop a comment below and share your story. Reading about your experiences helps remind us all that we aren't alone in these struggles, and I love reading what you have to say. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel for more great videos. Your support helps us keep bringing you empowering stories about justice, resilience, and taking back control of your life. You owe toxic people nothing, and you owe yourself everything. Thank you for watching. Their actions. Surviving them, thriving despite them, and ultimately enforcing ironclad boundaries against them is the ultimate victory. If you have ever been the scapegoat, the unwanted spare, or the child left on the porch, know this: the people who discarded you did not define your value. They merely revealed their own limitations. You have the power to write your own story, to choose your own family, and to build an empire out of the very bricks they threw at you. You owe them nothing. You owe yourself everything.